Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ryan Bentley. I'm a board member of the Foster Family Alliance. Just want to welcome everybody to the summit. Hope you're enjoying it as much as we are. And just always want you to know we're here to support you in any way. Reach out to us, please. And we can support. We definitely want to, make everybody's lives better. That's what our goal is for kids and for families. So, my honor to introduce Vic Armstrong. He's the director of the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. He's going to take some time today and do a presentation for us on suicide prevention. So, a very important topic, and appreciate you being here today, Vic.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you for the introduction. And, I apologize. I was scheduled to be a little earlier, and we had some technical difficulties. But nevertheless, I'm glad to be here. And we're going to talk about something for the next few minutes that is, it's not necessarily a fun topic to talk about, but it's a very important and relevant topic, and that is on youth suicide. So first, I just want to share some underlying facts about youth suicide, and particularly as it pertains to North Carolina. In 2018, 52 North Carolina youth ages 10 to 17 died by suicide. And in 2019, that number was 36. So we saw a decrease going into 2019. I will tell you that preliminary data is still out. There's usually a lag time in data. So we don't really know what the results are of suicide from 2020. Preliminary data does not necessarily show a significant increase, that there may still be a decline. But what we have seen is that several states in their preliminary data did find that there appeared to be an increase in suicide in Black and Brown communities. So we continue to look at that, but North Carolina has been trending in the right direction, at least for the past, at least going into 2019. In 2018, the youth suicide rates and firearm-related death rates for children and youth were the highest seen by the Child Fatality Task Force. And I would also note that, not surprisingly, the most lethal means of suicide is by firearm. And males, much more often than females, utilize firearms, which is why the death rate from suicide attempts for males is much higher than females, even though females attempt suicide at a much higher rate. And, I think it's important to point out that that's not to say that gun owners are any more lethal or suicidal, but it is to say that it's just a much more lethal means of attempting suicide. Roughly speaking, about 90% of the people who attempt suicide by firearm die, and about 90% of those who attempt suicide by other means live. So we know suicide by firearm is the most lethal. And roughly about half the suicides that occur are through use of firearms. In 2018, suicide was the leading cause of death for North Carolina youth ages 15 to 17. And the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 14. In 2019, suicide was the third leading cause of death for ages 15 to 17, and the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 14. Firearms are the most lethal means in the use in nearly half of youth suicide in North Carolina. And again, that is true of suicides in general, that about half the suicide deaths are by firearm. In the 10-year period from 2010 to 2019, North Carolina lost more than 460 children aged 17 and younger to firearm-related injuries. And in the 4-year period from 2016 to 2019, there were 437 firearm hospitalizations and 1,246 firearm-related emergency department visits for children and youth in North Carolina aged 0 to 17. And just to show you a little bit about kind of where things are trending, so you can see here from the graph, there's the suicide rates for ages 10 to 17 in North Carolina from 2000 to 2019. This may be a little difficult to see, but there's a lighter kind of purplish line that is above the red line. The purplish line is the U.S. Suicide rates, and the red line is the North Carolina suicide rates. And so these are deaths per 100,000 ages 10 to 17. And so we have seen a decrease in suicides from year to year. And this is a slide from the chief examiner. I think that we may be losing part of the wording on these slides, but the slide to the far left, to my left, is showing the means of suicide, and so you can see that the most suicides by firearm, followed by asphyxiation, and then the slide to the right shows the age, the categories by age, and so you can see where for age 5 to 9, which is at the very bottom, very few, but we do see some suicides in that age range, and then you see the 10 to 14 and the 15 to 17-year-old age range. And you can also see in the middle firearm suicides by age, and you can see where people fall. That primarily you're looking at the 15 to 17-year-olds that experience more suicide deaths by firearm. Here you see the percentage of high school students who strongly agree or disagree they feel good about themselves. And you can see that from 2011 to 2019, that rate has gone down. Students who strongly agree or agree they feel good about themselves. Now, I would anticipate that just looking at this particular stat, I would not expect it to be higher in 2020. I think that when we know that a lot of teens were experiencing social isolation, they couldn't participate in sports, couldn't spend time with their friends. You had high school students who couldn't attend their graduations. So I would imagine that this number for 2020 would continue to trend down, but we don't have that data just yet. And this is the percentage of high school students who agree or strongly agree that they feel alone in their life. And you can see that trend has trended upward. And again, I would imagine that if we were to look at the numbers from 2020, this would continue this upward trend of students who agree or strongly agree that they feel alone in their lives because of the social isolation associated with the pandemic. These are the percentage of high school students who felt sad or hopeless. And so again, you can see that trend has gone upward from 2011, went down a little bit 2015, but then continued to increase over the next few years from 2017 to 2019. And this graph depicts suicidal behaviors from 2013 to 2019 for North Carolina high school students. So the blue bar, which is the highest one, that represents kids who seriously considered attempting suicide during the past 12 months. The red indicates that they made a plan for a suicide attempt during the past 12 months. The green is the kids that attempted suicide or attempted suicide in 2013, attempted suicide, but the question wasn't asked in 2013 or 2015. And then the purple is that had made an suicide attempt during the past 12 months. And that's a suicide attempt that resulted in hospitalization. And then here you see the trends in suicidal behaviors. 2019 high school students, you see the number of kids that seriously considered attempting suicide during the first 12 months. They made a plan for suicide attempt during the past 12 months. They attempted suicide during the past 12 months. Then they made a suicide attempt during the past 12 months that resulted in hospital visit. And you can see the comparison between heterosexual kids and gay, lesbian, and bisexual kids. Statistically, kids who identify as gay, lesbian, and bisexual are 3 times more likely to consider suicide and 5 times more likely to actually attempt suicide. And here you see the trends in kids that seriously considered suicide 2009, 2019, again, high school students. And again, you can see that the trend has has gone up in that time span. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the whys around suicide, and then talk a little bit also about how we should talk about it with our teens, and then maybe we can have some conversation about it. But when you ask the question, why suicide, most teens who have been interviewed after a suicide attempt say that what causes teens suicide are feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. Suicidal teens often feel like they are in situations where they have no solutions. The teens can see no way out but death, and the teens feel like they have no control to change their situations. And we'll touch on this again toward the end. But I do think it's very important to understand that and this is not just teens. It's when we think about suicide in general, it is important to understand that people who attempt suicide, for the most part, do not really want to die. They're looking for a way to end their pain, and they often see suicide as the only means of ending that pain. And so teens are no different. Part of the challenge with teens is that they oftentimes are not going to have the life experience to really think beyond their situation, and to realize that they haven't had the life experience to say, I've been through worse times than this before, I can pull through this. So they have an additional challenge when they're feeling depressed or anxious. So there are both risk factors and protective factors, and there are also warning signs of teens who may be at risk for suicide. And while there's no single cause for suicide, there are risk factors and warning signs which may increase the likelihood of an attempt. And learning these risk signs and learning how to have those conversations can save the lives of the young people in your life. So just a few of the warning signs of suicide in children and teens. Obviously, making suicidal statements. And I encourage people all the time, do not take suicidal statements lightly. If a child or an adult, for that matter, says to you that they're thinking about ending their life, that they're thinking about dying, they don't want to be here anymore, take that very seriously. Don't brush it off. Don't look at it as they're just trying to get attention. But take that very, very seriously, because that is one of the warning signs of suicide. Also being preoccupied with death in conversation, writing, or drawing. So, a lot of kids journal, or they like to doodle. And if they seem to have an obsession with death, and particularly if this is something that has come on of late, and it's not who they've always been, then take note of that. That may be a sign that young person is thinking about suicide. If they all of a sudden start to give away their belongings, whether they give them to their siblings or friends, and particularly things that they seemingly have cherished in the past, but now they seem to be wanting to give all their belongings away, as if they're not going to need them going forward, not going to want them going forward, that's also a sign that they may be thinking about ending their life, and they feel like, well, I'm not going to have need of this, so I want to make sure somebody else has it. Withdrawing from friends and family, and this can be difficult because for a lot of teenagers, a lot of young people, that's a part of being a teenager. They start to withdraw. They start to want to spend time by themselves. And it's one thing for teens to want their independence, but when it seems like all they want to do is just be alone, they don't want to be around anybody else. That can be a warning sign, because oftentimes one of the signs of depression is that social withdrawal. And so you want to be aware of that. And then having aggressive or hostile behavior. One of the challenges oftentimes with kids is that depression looks different in children. For an adult, depression may look like tearfulness. It may look like sadness. It may look like loss of appetite and inability to sleep or oversleeping. Oftentimes in children, depression looks like anger. It looks like acting out. And so oftentimes when you see a child suddenly become aggressive or hostile or angry or lashing out, that may be a sign that child is experiencing depression, and you may want to get them to talk to someone. Now, one of the things I encourage people is, particularly with with older kids, adolescent age to late teens, I know sometimes parents struggle with getting them to talk to someone. And one of the things I encourage, and we'll talk again a little bit more about this, is I do think it starts with the parent trying to make conversation with the child. But there are other options. If they won't agree to see a therapist, sometimes you may be able to get them to open up to their pediatrician or family doctor. And you may be able to encourage them to talk to a clinician, but it may take just the right clinician. I know for a lot of, particularly with single moms that have African-American mothers that have boys, they feel like, right or wrong, and in some cases, they've gotten this from their children, that they only want to talk to a black male. It may be that a female, young girl, only wants to talk to a female. And so I think sometimes it's also a question of getting them the right fit. So instead of just saying, I'm going to send you to this clinician because the first person I found in the book, sometimes it's helpful to get some at least try to have some kind of frame of mind for a framework for who your child might open up to and who they might be willing to talk to. Other warning signs can include neglecting personal appearance, particularly if this is a child that has been more attentive to their personal appearance, has been more meticulous about how they look, and then all of a sudden they don't seem to care. That can be a warning sign. Running away from home, because oftentimes running away from home is, again, trying to run away from pain. So that can be a warning sign. Risk-taking behavior, such as reckless driving or being sexually promiscuous. Again, sometimes these things are acting out because of depression, but risk-taking behavior oftentimes is a sign that at the very least the person is indifferent about being alive, and they're just tempting fate and taking risk and saying, well, if I die, I die, it will all be over. So if you see that in your young person, that can also be a warning sign. And a change in personality, such as a child who's always been outgoing, upbeat, and that's their personality, they're extroverted, and then all of a sudden they become very withdrawn and quiet. That can be a warning sign and something to be on the lookout for. And there are some problems that increase the chance of suicidal thoughts, including depression or another mental health problem such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, the onset for schizophrenia is usually late adolescent to early 20s. So there are some young people who do have their first episode of psychosis in their teens, late teens. And so that's one of the things that can lead to suicidal ideation, because oftentimes a young person may not know how to handle the schizophrenia or that bipolar disorder, because those mood swings, particularly the depressive mood swings, may put them in a place where they just feel like they're in this dark place that they can't get out of, and they see suicide as the only option. And the other end of the spectrum is sometimes for a person who is bipolar, that manic depressive swing, they may do something in their manic phase that they feel like they can't live down, that they're embarrassed about. So when kids do, if you have young people who are experiencing mental health challenges like this, it is very important to keep them involved in talking with the mental health professional. Also, a parent with depression or substance use disorder can also be a red flag, and that can be something that increases the chances that the child is going to also have some susceptibility to having suicidal thoughts. And if they've ever tried suicide before, and that's not to say that everyone who attempts suicide is going to attempt again, but if they've ever attempted suicide, that's a warning sign that is a place that they can go. If they get in a dark enough place, suicide is going to be an option. And so that's another reason to just be mindful and as much as possible, keep them engaged with the mental health professional. A friend, a peer, a family member, or a hero, such as a sports figure or musician who recently attempted or died by suicide. That's one of the reasons that we don't like to sensationalize suicide. And we try to see it for what it is. It's a tragedy. It's not something where we think that suicide needs to be glorified, but we do treat it as a tragedy, as a tragic loss. A disruptive or abusive family life. Kids who are raised in traumatic or abusive environments oftentimes will experience suicidal ideation because they have that feeling of helplessness or hopelessness. And also a history of sexual abuse is also something to be mindful of. Oftentimes sexual abuse can trigger a number of mental health challenges for young people and older adults as well. But that's also something we need to look at. And a history of being bullied, particularly today with cyberbullying being so prevalent. We need to be mindful of it because kids who are bullied have a much higher likelihood of having suicidal thoughts. And then protective factors. Protective factors are conditions or attributes, skills, strengths, resources, supports, or coping strategies in individuals, families, or communities that help people deal more effectively with stressful events and mitigate or eliminate risk in families or communities. So there are some protective factors that can help young people to be less likely to attempt suicide. Major protective factors for suicide include effective behavioral health care, and that is really looking out for their mental wellness. And oftentimes as adults, we model that mental wellness for the young people in our lives. It's knowing when to take breaks, knowing when to, and particularly if we look at this past year of the pandemic, it's knowing that you need to practice self-care. Get outside, get fresh air, get exercise, try to eat as healthy as possible. All those things impact your mental well-being. And then also giving yourself time away from social media and taking breaks and taking opportunity to do things that you enjoy so that you can give yourself that mental wellness break. Connectedness to families, to individuals, family, community, and social institutions, which again, we know has been difficult in the past year, but that is a protective factor. If you can keep them engaged, because one of the things that continues to signal to a young person is that they're not alone, that they have individuals around them, they have a community around them, and that can be one of the protective factors. And life skills, including problem-solving skills and coping skills, and the ability to adapt to change. Some of that may be innate for a lot of people, that they just seem to have the ability to figure things out and to cope no matter how tough things get. And for others, that can be a learned skill set. And we can work with our young people to help them think about things and process things in a way that helps them figure out how to cope, how to get themselves out of ruminating on negative situations, and how to think things through rather than feeling like, this is the end because I just don't see a way out. Self-esteem and a sense of purpose or meaning in life. And again, that is something that may be innate to that child, but it's also something that we can boost. We can boost their self-esteem. We can help them feel like they have purpose and meaning in life by talking to them about how important they are, how special they are, by taking pride in the things that they do when they have successes, and by understanding when sometimes they have failures, that we all have failures sometimes. So we can help to reinforce and boost their self-esteem. And then cultural, religious, or personal beliefs that discourage suicide. I know that one of the things that I always heard when I was growing up was that Black people didn't die by suicide. Now, there are two sides of the coin there, because part of the challenge, I think, growing up in the African-American community and being raised in the African-American church was that it did give me a sense of belonging and connection to a higher power. But at the same time, I know that I grew up hearing that suicide was a sin. If you died by suicide, you were going to hell. And one of the things that did was it kept us from talking about suicide. It was a very taboo subject. And if someone did lose a family member by suicide, no one knew how to reach out to them to comfort their family because it was such a taboo subject. And no one wanted to talk about the consequences of suicide. So there is value in that sense of belonging to something and having that sense of purpose. But we also need to be able to utilize that sense of belonging, sense of purpose in a way that's constructive to build that individual, that young person up, rather than creating more guilt and making them feel like when they by having anxiety or depression, you are somehow morally or spiritually weak, and that's what we want to avoid. And then knowing that it is okay to talk. One of the misconceptions about the discussion of suicide is that talking about it causes kids and teens to think about it. The truth is that parents can never know for certain whether or not a child experiences suicidal thinking if they are too afraid to ask the question. And one of the things that I always tell people is you don't really make someone suicidal by talking about it, but you might save their life by talking about it. But oftentimes parents don't know because they're afraid to ask the question. And it's a natural feeling because we often think, well, if a person is not suicidal, first of all, am I going to put the thought in their head? Well, that's scientifically not the way it works. But there's also this perception that I'm going to somehow offend them and alienate them by asking the question. But I would much rather offend someone by asking the question than to lose that person because I don't ask the question. So I always encourage families to talk about it. Don't be afraid to ask the question if you feel like your young person is contemplating suicide. So what do we say, particularly to younger children, about suicide? For preschool and kindergarten age children, it is important to stick to the basics. Talk to them about someone passing from suicide like you would any other disease. Use clear and concise words like, I have some news to tell you, Uncle John died. Avoid a lot of details. You can encourage questions and feelings and accept their reaction to the news. Some children will cry while others will seem indifferent. Both reactions are okay and normal because children oftentimes don't know how to process death. The thing about it is having the conversation and telling them that someone has died, it helps them to process that, to learn about death and accept death as a part of life. But at the same time, you're not sensationalizing the fact that they died by suicide. You're just explaining it like any other death, that the person died. As kids get a little bit older beyond that preschool age, a lot depends on where your child is in terms of their understanding, because you can, when kids get a little bit older, you can talk to them about suicide, but it's important to know, to ask them at that point what they understand about suicide and what they understand about death in general. But keeping the lines of communication open and letting them know it's okay for them to ask questions and letting them know that however they respond, whatever their feelings are okay, is one of the ways that you help them to process that loss of life. Now, older kids, first of all, for older kids, it is important if you want to talk to them about suicide, particularly if they've lost someone to suicide, to ask your teen what they know about suicide. Gather information, present facts, and dispel any myths they may have heard, including the idea that those who take their own life are selfish or weak. There are a lot of resources out there. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has a lot of good information. The American Association of Suicidology has a lot of good information. Both their websites have information. You can find information with NAMI. You can also go to the Trevor Project that has a lot of information, particularly pertaining to LGBTQ youth. So I encourage you to, if you're going to have conversations, arm yourself with as much information as you can and kind of know what the facts are about suicide. And one of the facts that a lot of parents don't know, I think, is that it happens a whole lot more than we are aware of. Attempts happen a whole lot more than we are aware of. And kids die by suicide more than we are aware of, because a lot of suicides are not reported as suicide because of the stigma attached to them. Also, answer any questions they may have without shaming them, without judgment, or without fear. Don't be shocked and react when they have questions. Just try to calmly answer the questions that they have. Because if they're thinking about suicide and they ask you questions about it, or you're talking to them about suicide and you look shocked or you start to get emotional at the conversation, they may shut down. Or they may feel like, I can't have this conversation with you because you can't handle it. So try to answer any questions they may have without shame, judgment, or fear. I always remind them that help is available if they ever find themselves in that position. They can talk to you. They can talk to another caring adult. They can always call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number is 1-888-273-TALK or 1-888-273 8255. So they can always call, 1-800. 273-255. So they can always call that number, but they can also talk to caring adults about what's going on and then validate their feelings. Whatever they're feeling, help them to know that their feelings are okay. Don't make them feel like they are wrong or that what they're feeling is stupid. Validate their feelings. I'm sorry that you feel that way, but let's talk about it. Why you're feeling that way, and how can we help you to feel better? And then always keep in mind that the best time to talk about suicide with your kids is when they're not in a crisis. So if you want to have that conversation, it's much better to try to have that conversation before there is a crisis, before they lose someone to suicide. And kids hear about it. And if kids hear that someone died by suicide, or they hear about it on television, that's an opportunity to say, hey, what do you know about suicide? What do you how often do you think it happens? What are your feelings about it? And have that conversation with them. And in that conversation, there's an opportunity to say to them, if you ever find yourself in a place where you just don't know what else to do, I'm here, and you can talk to me about that. And it's sometimes difficult to find the words. Are you thinking of ending your life? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Few phrases are as difficult to say to a loved one, but when it comes to suicide prevention, no words are more important than asking those words. And here's some ways to kind of get the conversation started. First of all, just start the conversation. Particularly if you think that a child is thinking of hurting themselves, start the conversation. And I always say, and even though I just said hurting themselves, I ask specifically, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about ending your life? And then listen. Express concern, but reassure them that they're not alone. Reassure them that they are valued. Reassure them that they are cared about. And again, don't react with shock and awe, and just try to talk to them and be supportive. And then create a safety plan. If they express that they are in a place where they don't know if they can keep themselves safe or not, don't leave them alone. Try to get them access to someone to talk to, but then have a plan in place for if you're not going to be with them, what do you do when you start to feel like things are falling apart? If you feel like you're in a dark place, let's talk about it. Or you may want to check in with them every day just to say, hey, how you doing? How you feeling? Let's talk about this. And then by all means, get help from a professional. You don't have to go through this alone. And even that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available to anyone who wants to talk about it, has questions about suicide. The majority of the people who call the line are not suicidal. The majority of people who call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline are people who want information and just want someone to talk to. So there's always help out there. And there are always support groups with NAMI and other organizations. So what do you say to a teen that has attempted suicide? And that's a very difficult conversation to say, but the most important thing to say is, I love you. These are simple words that you may have said 1,000 times before, but in a time like this, don't let the words go unspoken. Let them know that they are loved. Let them know that they matter. Oftentimes for people who have attempted suicide, they've done so because they feel like they're a burden to others and that their lives are not worth living. And so it's important to let them know that they are loved. And also say, I'm sorry things got so bad for you. When someone attempts suicide, oftentimes others will try to minimize the struggle with platitudes that simply aren't helpful, like saying it's not that bad. Well, that minimizes that person's feelings. So don't minimize their feelings. Instead, express your sympathy in a way that's supportive. Acknowledge that he or she must have felt like suicide was the only option, because by doing that, you're lending them support. I'm sorry things got so bad for you. I know that you were in such a dark place that it seemed like the only way out. And then we can open up the conversation for, how can I support you? Which leads to the third point. I'm here for you. Now that they've attempted had a suicide attempt, it's a really good time to remind your teen that you're there for him or her. You don't have to understand the struggle. You're not going to understand the pain that someone else goes through. No one ever understands someone else's pain. You don't have to understand the struggle or the suicide attempt. If you've never been in that place, you're not necessarily going to understand how you get in such a deep, dark place. But you only have to be there to listen. So let them know, I'm here for you. Now, what not to say to a teen who's attempted suicide? I understand what you're going through. Even if you've had suicidal thoughts and made an attempt yourself, you don't know what this person is going through or has gone through. So don't say, I understand what you're going through, because it then minimizes their situation. And sometimes that's our attempt by doing that, is to say you're not alone. But what you are actually saying to them is that it's really not that bad. I understand it, when you really don't. And what you really want to communicate to them is that simply that I don't know what what you were feeling. I can't fully understand your pain, but I do want you to know that you're not alone. And never say, why didn't you get help sooner? Why didn't you call out sooner? Why didn't you let me know something sooner? And you may be feeling this question on a really deep level because you want to know. And you're filled with a lot of emotion. And you want to know, why didn't you reach out to me? Why didn't you cry out for help? But this falls in the category of victim blaming, and it's counterproductive. This is not the time to blame them for not reaching out for help, because remember, they were in a place where they just did not think that coming out of that situation and feeling better was an option. And then never say that suicide is a selfish act. Don't make it about you or other people. This is something else that people say that blames the person who attempted suicide. Your main goal should be to lift their spirits instead of breaking them down. So you don't want to say to them, this is selfish. Think about what you've done to me or your family. We also often have a tendency to want to say, well, think about how you're going to be hurting other people. But what they need at that time is really not responsibility and blame. They need support. And they really need you to make them feel like they are supported, not that you're counting on them to support someone else, and that by feeling suicidal, by attempting suicide, they're disappointing other people. And in thinking again about why suicide, what is important to remember is that teens attempt or die by suicide not because of a desire to die, but rather in an attempt to escape a bad situation and or painful feelings. It's rare that only a single event leads to suicide. This means that by helping a teen to turn around a bad situation, or by teaching her or him how to better deal with painful feelings, we can defeat the causes of teen suicide. Most times this requires professional help by a doctor or a clinician. The thing I will say about this too is that, and I often share with people, that suicide itself is not a disease. Suicide is the worst possible outcome of the culmination of a lot of very complex things, oftentimes including mental health challenges. But what that means is that there are oftentimes opportunities to intervene along the way. Now, when I say that, please understand that if you've lost someone to suicide, or if you've had someone that you love attempt suicide, there's not a whole lot of value in beating yourself up and saying, I should have been a better parent, a better spouse, a better friend, because you did the best that you could with the information that you had. But what I am saying is that what we do know now is that suicides are preventable and very often can be prevented. And sometimes it's as simple as opening up the lines of communication and having those conversations and not minimizing the pain that people are going through. So if you have a young person, you've seen the signs that we've talked about here, you feel like this is someone who really is crying out for help, don't take that lightly, but have those conversations, because those conversations might save that loved one's life. So thank you. If we have time, we can entertain questions.
If anybody has any questions, I can put them in the chat. We can read them. But that was a lot of information. Really appreciate a lot of helpful tips, on what we need to do to try to help prevent suicide. As you said, a huge problem can be prevented. Communication is really the key to just open and loving communication, like you said, can really make a difference in saving somebody's life that you really love.
All right, I'm trying to get back to you here. Yeah, I'm assuming you can still see me, but I cannot see you.
Okay. Yeah, we can see you. We can see your slides. So,
Okay.
but yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat, but if any come up, we'll address them. But just great information that you shared. Like you said,
Sure, yeah.
Communication can save somebody's life, and that
Absolutely.
can't be scared to have that conversation, because if you don't, and then they're gone, it's too late.
Yeah, and and I think you have the slides, so I'm happy to, if you want to share them with folks, that's
Sure.
That's perfectly fine.
Okay.
So they can have those tips there. And I just remind people that there's always help out there. Not only is is your team not alone, but for parents, you're not alone either. There's always help out there, always people that you can talk to.
And I don't know if you can see the chat, Vic, but TJ Pittman put his information in there, and I can forward that on to you. He said he would like to talk to you one-on-one at some time.
Sure. Yep, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be a horrible thing to lose somebody just because you're scared to have a conversation. I mean, yeah. Communication can prevent so many things in our lives if we're just open with kids and each other. I mean, just tell people how you feel, and if you think you're going to hurt somebody's feelings, it might save their life.
Yeah, and I do understand it is a difficult conversation to have. It's never an easy conversation, but it is much easier to have the conversation on the front end than to be wondering on the back end if I could have done something, if I should have said something. And when I say it happens more often than we realize, I've had, particularly because I do a lot of work in the suicide awareness space, I've had family members, I've had people I went to high school with, I've had coworkers that have come to me and said, I've been there. I've had a family member tell me that they had attempted suicide 3 different times, and nobody in the family knew.
Sure.
Because he was too ashamed to admit it. I've had another family member who, when we were kids, and I vaguely remember the situation where he had to go to the hospital, and he informed me, as now that we're adults, that what had happened at that time was he took an overdose of pills. He was trying to kill himself, 14 years old.
Wow.
And these are family members that I grew up with that I had no idea, what they were going through. I have classmates that that I talk to. They tell me about their struggles with anxiety and depression and suicidality, but also they tell me about the struggles that their kids have, trying to make it through college or high school, or, starting out in life and having mental health challenges, and often, feeling suicidal. So it happens a whole lot more than we think.
Sure.
And one of the things that has been the most, I think the most uplifting to me is the fact that, when people do reach out to me and say, hey, I'm going through this, it just reinforces to me that people want to talk about these things. They just want to have a safe space to do it. And we can create those safe spaces by normalizing the conversation and being willing to talk about it.
Yeah. I'm just writing down some information. Somebody, Lydia, she said, how do you motivate a child and person that doesn't want to go outside, doesn't want to socialize, etc.? Looks like they are in a dark space in their life. So I just maybe some motivated options.
Yeah. Part of what's helpful is, again, not to react and respond to the behavior, but to try to understand what's behind the behavior. One of the first things that we do is we start trying to change the behavior without understanding what's motivating it. So it's helpful to try to talk with that young person, understand, what's going on with them. Is there a reason that you don't want to go outside? Sometimes people don't want to be active because they may have physical pain that they're not talking about. But try to understand, why is it that you want to be by yourself a lot? And it's different too. This is a child that's always been an introvert. It's a little different than someone who maybe you've seen a change in their personality. But still, for young people are usually very social. So when you see a young person who just wants to be isolated, be by themselves, the first thing is to have that conversation with them, to try to get them to open up about what they're feeling. And again, not doing it in a judgmental way. But just try to understand why do you prefer to be by yourself a lot? And then for a lot of young people, if it's difficult to get them to talk to you or to talk to a therapist or psychiatrist, sometimes the easiest place to start is with a pediatrician or primary care provider. If they're seeing a pediatrician, sometimes a pediatrician can have the conversation with them because they frame it more as a part of just a normal physical, interaction, just to say, well, how you feeling? Are you getting any exercise? Are you sleeping well? How's your mood? And it kind of normalizes the conversation because they're used to asking questions about their health. It just becomes more focused on their mental health. And for kids who may be dealing with some depression or anxiety, oftentimes a primary care physician or pediatrician can prescribe medications if that's what's needed. But they can also refer to a mental health specialist if they think that's what's needed. So I'd say if you can't get them to talk to someone else and they won't talk to you, I would try to see if they'll open up to their pediatrician.
And then Lisa made a comment earlier, and she just said she wanted to kind of reiterate, but she said great prevention skills so very needed, especially in this day and times. And he kind of also talked about, the bullying and things like that, that they're hitting that off now at the elementary level because it is such an issue these days.
Yeah.
Board, social media.
Yeah, and I know too. It's a touchy subject, but as much as possible, I think parents should be aware of what their kids are doing on social media, not just because they may be interacting with sexual predators or seeing things they shouldn't, but oftentimes kids are getting bullied through social media. You don't realize this until it's too late. But to try to be aware of where they're spending their time on social media, have conversations with them about what they're seeing, what they're hearing. And again, the more you can normalize those conversations, and particularly early on, the less intrusive it's going to feel to that young person. So I know my kids I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, and so right now, they're at the age where we monitor everything that they have access to. And so my hope is that as they get older, that'll be normalized for them, that we're going to be aware of what they're doing on social media. I know you can't be aware of everything that your kids are doing, but as much as possible, you want to try to normalize the behavior that, I want to be aware of what you're doing on social media because I want to support you and I want to protect you. And that in some ways can help kids who are being bullied, because sometimes even when kids are bullied on social media, they still feel like they're going to be socially outcast if they pull away from it. And then sometimes it's hard for them to talk about because they're being bullied about things that for kids are very personal. I know all of us growing up, looking back now, all of us probably there's always some body feature that kids zero in on, and that becomes your thing they tease you about. When I was growing up, it was my nose. They always said, you got a big nose. And it used to really bother me, but there was no social media presence back then. But, looking back on that and how I internalized that, and then, to think today when, kids on social media who may have much bigger issues than someone talking about the size of their nose, but you've also got access to hundreds and even thousands of people who are also seeing and exchanging that message. It's a lot of pressure for a young person. And, we just need to be aware of those things and try to be supportive as possible.
Yeah, and I think it's, when we were growing up, the social media wasn't there. Like you said, this is now following you home. It's one thing to teach in school, but now you come home and you get on your computer to talk to your friends, and there's things like that. Yeah, so it's very important, I think, to monitor what the kids are looking at. And if there's an issue, bring it to the school, bring it to something. But don't let that go on and really hurt a child, because that could really do some damage.
And then too, try to have some guidelines, some rules about how much time they spend on social media as well. For the question about the kid who never wants to go outside, there's data now that points to social media potentially being addictive, and so kids can get caught up in not wanting to get away from their their iPads or their cell phones, or And so try to limit how much time they spend on social media and encourage them to get out and have face-to-face interaction and get outside and get fresh air.
TJ Pittman had wrote, we struggle with the teen behavior. Is the behavior part of depression, or is it just the teen trying to find themselves? I guess just trying to figure out, is this normal?
Yeah.
You know, what it is.
Yeah, and that's sometimes hard with kids, but part of it is it's what you're seeing normal for that kid, because everybody's different. And if you see sudden changes in behavior, that's sometimes an indication that something else is going on. And then, we know that kids are going to be kids, and they're gonna have their challenges. But if something does not seem age appropriate, if you've got a 14-year-old who's drinking, well, that's not age appropriate. If you got a 14, 15-year-old who runs off for days at a time, or storms out of the house in the middle of the night and gone all night, that's not age appropriate. And so when you see those kinds of things, we can sometimes tell ourselves that it's just a part of a kid being a kid, but it also may be an indication that this is a child that's struggling with some anxiety or depression. And I always say, again, have the conversation and try to talk about what's going on with them and be supportive. And then B, try to get them to talk to someone else. I would always say err on the side of getting them support as opposed to not. And so if you have the question as to whether or not what you're seeing is normal teen behavior, if you have to question it, chances are it's not normal teen behavior.
And like you said, I think the more people you can get involved, somebody may find that common ground that's going to make the child more comfortable to have that conversation.
Yeah.
So it's nothing to be ashamed of if people are acting, children are acting that way. We just need to talk to them and try to find a way to help.
Yeah.
That really needs to be the main goal. Does anybody else have any other questions or anything they'd like to throw out there, to conversation starters or anything to talk about? Because this is an extremely important subject. I mean, if you can save somebody's life, have that conversation, because you'll regret it. You'll really regret it if something happens. You got anything else for us, Vic?
No, just know that there is help out there. There's hope out there. You're not alone. And for anyone here who's listening now who may be struggling themselves, I just always tell people that the most important thing, whatever you do, and I encourage you to share this with anyone else who's struggling, is whatever it takes, do what you have to do to be here tomorrow. Life does get better. You're not in this alone. You matter. Your life matters. Your pain matters. And above and beyond everything else, we want you to be here tomorrow and every day after that. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Vic. That was great. We really appreciate it. Everybody have a good, about 15 minutes short here. So just 2 o'clock is going to be the celebration. So everybody please stick around for that. We want to thank everybody for coming, and we really appreciate everything everybody does. And thanks again, Vic.
Thank you.
All right, goodbye.